Welcome, everybody. My name is Leslie Shade, and I'm a professor at the Faculty of Information, University of Toronto. I'm serving as a moderator for this roundtable on algorithmic literacy. I'm first going to provide a brief introduction to the purpose and organization of the roundtable, and then an introduction to the roundtable participants before diving into our session. I'm coming to you from my very messy virtual office located in Ottawa, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and we give thanks as their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this place. This roundtable will discuss the concept and parameters of algorithmic literacy. A key concern is that algorithms embed socio-technical power imbalances that are entrenched in a multitude of our digital devices and applications that are quite opaque to us. How can we get under and into and infiltrate these black boxes? What does it mean to say that we are algorithmically literate? What are algorithmic literacy gaps? Further, how can algorithmic literacy be integrated into formal and informal educational programming and digital literacy initiatives for a variety of people? So from young people to seniors, to newcomers, to young adults. Are there best practices for integrating algorithmic literacy into digital literacy programs and education? And how might this be done from a human rights perspective? And in terms of governance, are there various codes of practice and principles for algorithmic transparency and digital and data literacy from a range of stakeholders, including government and civil society, that serve as good practices? Or are there some that serve as really worse practices that we want to avoid? I just want to first introduce our panelists in alphabetical order, and then I'll get to the series of questions that we're going to be posing this afternoon. And these introductions will be done in alphabetical order. Monica Jean Henderson is a resident junior fellow at Massey College and a PhD student in the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. She completed her BA and her master's degree in Communication and Media Studies in the Department of Communication at Calgary. Monica's research interests explore the discursive relationships between material adult literacy practices and framings of digital literacy in policy. In her doctoral work, Monica investigates how crucial funding is to adult literacy programming, and this is inhibited due to neoliberal policy bias towards the ideal or the innovative user of technology. Her research and policymaking goals are to contribute to justice and equity for low literacy adults who are often invisibilized in both academic discourse and Canadian federal and provincial policy. Alicia Lim is currently writing a PhD dissertation on digital media at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information, where they are also project manager for the Critical Design Methods Institute. They are an award-winning queer filmmaker and graphic novelist whose high-profile activist career is the subject of their research into social media's distortion of identity politics. Their concept of identity economics has been published in Social Media and Society, Documenta, Bitch Magazine, C Magazine, and a 2020 TEDx talk. In addition, their community-based award-winning claymation films, solo and group exhibits, curatorial projects, Anti-Racist Montreal Annual Festival, ULUR, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, solo and group exhibits, curatorial projects, anti-racist university curricula internationally, and documentation on academic monographs has been quite phenomenal in terms of thinking about the various nuances of algorithmic literacy. Jonathan Obar is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at York University. He also serves as a research fellow with the Quello Center, a communication policy research center at Michigan State University. His teaching and research focuses on information and communication policy and the relationship between digital technologies, civil liberties, and the inclusiveness of public culture. Recent academic publications address big data and privacy, internet routing and NSA surveillance, network neutrality, and digital activism. And he is co-editor of Strategies for Media Reform, International Perspectives, which was published by Fordham University Press. Karen Louise Smith is an assistant professor in communication, popular culture, and film at Brock University. Her research explores the tensions between openness, privacy, and participation in technologically mediated culture. Some of this research has been conducted in collaboration with Mozilla, a global nonprofit organization which is committed to the open web. From 2013 to 2015, Karen conducted collaborative research with Mozilla to build the Hive Toronto Digital Literacy Network, consisting of over 60 organizational members, public library systems, after-school programs. In 2017, Karen was awarded a Mozilla research grant for a project titled Add-ons for Privacy, Open Source Advocacy Tactics, for Internet Health. And she's also currently a collaborator on the Equality Project, which is examining issues such as privacy and cyberbullying, which face youth. And her work has been published in a range of journals, including Journal of Communication, the International Journal of Communication, IJOC, Surveillance in Society, and Computer-Supported Cooperative Work. As for me, I'm a professor at the Faculty of Information, University of Toronto, and my research focus since the mid-1990s has been on the social and policy aspects of information and communication technologies, with a particular focus on youth, gender, and political economy. I am also a co-investigator on the Equality Project, and this is a 7-year research partnership of scholars, community organizations, educators, policy institutes, and youth themselves, funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And we are exploring what youth think about privacy and equality in networked environments, with a particular focus on youth from marginalized communities. Indeed, my research and interests in algorithmic literacy stems from research I'm currently doing with 2 RAs on the project, Monica Henderson on this panel and Katie McKinnon, as well as work with other team leaders on the Equality Project. For instance, in some recent research that I conducted with the co-leads, Val Steves, Jane Bailey, also Jackie Burkell, and Pris Regan, we note that Canadian youth find algorithmic sorting confusing and restrictive, especially when it occurs in environments, including schools, where they have no choice but to participate. Further, we note that algorithmic practices have eroded young people's trust in platform corporations, with the surveillance that's very endemic in these practices, stifling creative uses and eroding their sense of privacy. So moving ahead, there are 4 sets of questions we'll consider in this roundtable. The first 2 are interlinked, and we'll have each participant respond individually to these questions. These are the roundtable questions. So how do you define algorithmic literacy? Big question. And what do you think are best practices for integrating algorithmic literacy into media/digital/data literacy programming? So I've asked each participant to answer that question. And then after that round, we'll do these next set of questions. What should be principles for algorithmic transparency? To whom can we make these systems accountable? And how can critical race and gender scholarship contribute or be incorporated into algorithmic literacy? We will open the roundtable up to questions and comments from the participants, and I will be monitoring the chat. So without further ado, I believe the first participant is Monica.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. And I'm kind of happy both my PhD and my master supervisor are here, so I'm feeling kind of spoiled. So as for how I define algorithmic literacy, I've been studying digital literacy since starting grad school, and it's literacy itself is so difficult to define just because there's so many different approaches and competencies that intertwine, interlock, or diverge. And so I usually just kind of return to something a little theoretical and abstract to talk about literacy, which is Paulo Freire's aphorism, to read the word and the world. And so to me, this is about like understanding a text or a medium and how it reflects or reproduces social, political, and economic conditions with the goal of achieving critical consciousness and working towards transformative social justice. So, in terms of algorithmic literacy, this would mean understanding how algorithms reflect or reproduce those conditions and how to develop a critical consciousness about them to move towards social justice. Um, and so recently I've been working on an extensive literature review for the Equality Project about algorithmic literacies. And pretty early on, I found that it's difficult to talk about algorithmic literacy without talking about data literacy, just because algorithms and data are so intertwined. And so I'll ask Alicia, can you move the slide forward, please? So this is a sort of in beginning concept map I've developed just as I'm working through some literature to talk about sort of where algorithmic literacy and data literacy overlap and how they are different, even if they're often talked about in similar discussions. And so you'll notice that I have in the center of the Venn diagram here sort of places that you'll encounter algorithms or data, of course, not an exhaustive list. And on each side, sort of trying to parse out what is different when we're looking at the algorithm in this medium or situation versus when we're looking at data. And typically, what data literacy I've noticed in the literature, we're often talking about privacy, data exploitation, mining, labor and data commodities, and knowing when and how your data is collected and how will it be used, typically in algorithms, and understanding how data is a resource, but also importantly, how data is chosen, such as like when we're training machine learning, how the data set we use to train that tool is itself important to like question for like race and gender, class biases, and so on. And so, yeah, this is kind of me working towards a definition of algorithmic literacy. Happy to talk about this. I hope that sort of answers the first question. As for the second question, about what I think are the best practices for integrating algorithmic literacy into literacy programming. I particularly am interested in programming for adults, and those adults specifically that are enrolled in basic literacy or digital literacy programs. And so in my literature review, I've come across, and in my own research, I've come across sort of the challenge to integrate this sort of learning into programs, because many of these students are like learning to read, like haven't finished K-12 education, learning to type or use email for the first time, and so to step up to algorithms, which are a lot more, both concrete and abstract, but very much not visible and concrete to like the naked eye. It's a difficult jump. And so, there are some authors that are coming up with sort of participatory embodied like activities for talking about algorithms and data. So Catherine Ignazio, for example, talks about creative data literacy activities, such as, have everyone in a classroom line up in a row and start sorting by, green shirts stand over there, red shirts stand over there, and what happens when somebody has both red and green on their shirt? How can you easily categorize that person? What problems does it cause? And having this is like sort of a way to start thinking about data and algorithms. But there's also the issue of balancing these discussions about privacy with the understanding that these technologies can connect people in meaningful ways, and trying not to find that balance between empowering and terrifying people. So there was actually one when I was in my master's, like research in the adult basic literacy, digital literacy classroom, sorry, the discussion around privacy came up, and one student raised their hand and was talking about how privacy is important. And at first, like, the instructor was like, oh, this is great, this is great. But then she said, because I'm pretty sure my TV is watching me. And so, not that is totally out there. I have a smart TV and it probably like tracks all kinds of stuff, like what I choose to watch and everything. But she was like convinced that her TV could see her. And so how do we balance those discussions for in those sort of situations? And lastly, the last thing I want to say is that before we can really meaningfully integrate these discussions into or these practices into programming, there are a lot of methodological gaps in algorithmic literacy research that are important to address. And so particularly in a lot of recent research, even in 2020, 2019, 2018, a lot of researchers are looking at algorithmic awareness as a way to measure algorithmic literacy, because, when we're working with algorithms, usually we're just trying to see how they work. We're not actually producing them ourselves. And so in measuring algorithmic awareness, however, a lot of these researchers are snowball sampling from their own personal networks, like on Twitter or, their own university pals. And so they actually say in their limitations that, the education level of our participants could be a limitation, talking about this. And to me, I find that like a little discouraging, or because I work specifically with populations that haven't finished K-12 education. And so if we're only measuring or defining algorithmic awareness, with participants that have a university education, these things, literacy of just reading and writing and math have a lot to, like on a basic level, have a lot to do with how we understand algorithms. And so, yeah, these are some challenges we have to look at. And I will also just plug for practices, the Digital Defense Playbook by the Our Data Bodies Project, I think is a fantastic example of participatory pedagogical design for data and algorithmic privacy. So yes, thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Monica. So next up is Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. First of all, thank you to the conference organizers and for putting this together, and of course to Leslie for leading our panel. One thing I want to comment on is how important it is that critical cultural scholars be involved in this debate, in this dialogue. The dialogue, the deliberations ongoing about algorithmic policy are often dominated by computer scientists, lawyers, and economists. And so a panel like this is, I think, exactly the sort of thing that we need in these policy debates. We need more of this sort of material, these perspectives, especially if we're going to, again, have these critical cultural perspectives reflected in the future of these systems. So in terms of, and if maybe you could go to the next slide, please. I'm an assistant professor at York University in the Communication Studies Department. Very happy to be here, of course. So when I was trying to think of how to define algorithmic literacy, there's a lot of related terms. It reminded me of Kennedy and Moss's concept of known or knowing publics, or rather that article, where they talk about strategies for moving individuals from like being a part of a known public to what they call a knowing public. And they describe efforts to, in order to do that, what you're attempting to do is to democratize data power. And in that article in Big Data and Society, they talk about ways to alter the power dynamics that currently exist and that are escalating. Things like, I'll just quote here, speaking about individuals in terms of becoming more powerful in the big data and algorithmic space, right? Data analytics should be subject to greater public supervision and regulation. The data and the algorithms should be available and accessible to all. And that these systems, while they're being used to help industry, government, etc., should also have the role of helping to train and create more reflexive, active, and even knowing publics. I'll just say this also, we could say that this is sort of a more specific way to think about algorithmic literacy, right? Understanding collection, management, retention, disclosure, use of data, descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, right? This sort of like the sort of specific checklist that you might want to create. More generally, I think we could also refer to Shade and Shepard's digital policy literacy, which I teach a lot in class, which is a great way, I think, to think about sort of the bigger, again, critical cultural questions that we need to be engaging people in when we're trying to move towards something like algorithmic literacy, right? Teaching and engaging people in policy processes that have to do with algorithms. Again, teaching and engaging people with regards to the political economy of media systems, as well as the third element of their definition of digital policy literacy, right? Teaching and engaging people in elements of infrastructure as it relates to these technologies. So can we just to the next slide, please? So moving to best practices. Now, I don't want to, and I sort of mentioned to Leslie at the beginning that I don't want to be overly critical of a lot of the, I don't want to be overly critical of, you know, the likely forward-thinking policy and other proposals that my colleagues are presenting. But what I've published in the literature tends to be fairly critical of the possibility of things like algorithmic transparency, or what I call data privacy self-management, or rather what Daniel Solove calls data privacy self-management, and I've adapted some of his work. What I do in a paper published in Big Data and Society is I adapt Walter Lippmann's argument he presented in The Phantom Public, where he talks about something called the fallacy of democracy, and I adapt it towards what I call the fallacy of data privacy self-management. While it's great to have these idealistic notions of what we should be teaching people as they move towards digital policy literacy or to becoming knowing publics, we need to be careful that we're not too idealistic and that we are proposing things that could never actually be achieved. And this is what Lippmann argues in The Phantom Public almost 100 years ago. He says, an ideal should express the true possibilities of its subject. And so you can maybe go to the next slide, please. What he talks about in The Phantom Public is, he says, in the concept of sort of a direct democracy, right? The idealistic scenario is that we have 30 million people deciding about how to fix potholes and run a healthcare system and the military and all the different things that government does. He says this is a fallacy because we don't have what he calls omnicompetence. We don't have the time to figure all of these things out, even if we did have the omnicompetence. And also, what's the system like to get 30 million people into a room to decide on everything? So I adapt this argument in the paper Big Data and the Phantom Public and call for what's called the fallacy of data privacy self-management. I similarly say, are we omnicompetent enough to learn all about all the algorithms, about all these big data systems? Do we have the time to address all of them? And by, you know, in sort of what system exists that would facilitate this? So I think if you take one thing away from this presentation, it's this. It's great to be idealistic, but we have to be careful that our idealism isn't just something we talk about. We must make sure that we move towards something that is practical. And maybe I'll save my answers for the next rounds, because there are some more practical things about, like, let's say, the information fiduciary, the infomediary, things that people are starting to talk about that move us away from things like the problematic notice and choice privacy policy model. And so if you could just move to the last slide, please. And so I just wanted to close on this because, you know, I started this brief talk thinking sort of, again, with these idealistic notions that we've seen in the literature about moving towards knowing publics. and digital policy literacy. And then I'm saying, well, maybe we're not smart enough, or we don't have the time. One thing that Lippmann says that I think is important to reiterate is he says, as I watch one thing, 1,000 others undergo great changes. And so if we're monitoring Google's algorithm, what about Walmart's algorithm and the bank's algorithm, right? And on and on and on, the government's algorithm. And so what Lippmann is doing here, it can sound undemocratic. And certainly Lippmann's critics have called this work undemocratic, pointing to John Dewey and saying we should use John Dewey's notion of participatory democracy as a guide. But John Dewey himself, and this is what I'll close on, I apologize if I'm going a bit long, read Lippmann's work, and this is what he said. Mr. Lippmann's essay is in reality a statement of faith in a pruned and temperate democratic theory and a presentation of methods by which a reasonable conception of democracy can be made to work. Not absolutely, but at least better than democracy works under an exaggerated and undisciplined notion of the public and its powers. So let's make sure that our idealism is not exaggerated and undisciplined. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Karen.
Hi, thanks for the intro, Leslie. I'm going to try and build upon ideas that both Jonathan and Monica have already presented, adapt my comments on the fly as we go. So from Jonathan, I really appreciated that he brought up ideas about the phantom public and how challenging it is for an individual to manage all of their data and to have a command of where it goes and what happens to it. Monica mentioned really a lot of the methodological gaps which exist in really understanding how we get to or how we do research on algorithmic literacy. And in preparing my comments for today, really what I've done is a little bit of a backwards design exercise to look at some of my research over the last few years and to try and surface really what questions underpin the research about algorithmic literacy and really what I've done, what my tactics have been to try and get at what it is and how we achieve it. So I have a first slide with a first question. And this resonates really, really strongly with Monica's Venn diagram about the bottom point was about inputs and outputs of data. And much of my research over the past few years has shared a commonality in asking the question, do citizens understand how their inputs are linked to outputs? And these might include content, which is presented to an end user, as well as the kinds of categorizations which are made about individuals, which lead to particular experiences, predictions, or even administrative or bureaucratic decision-making that may impact your life and your circumstances. So just as some really quick examples, I've noticed that a lot of my undergraduate students have a lot to say about what they see on TikTok on their For You pages. And I think this is really emblematic of really the kind of curation of content by algorithms. And I've been really fascinated by the diversity in experiences of what people see and what kind of explanations and mental models they have to make sense of what is presented to them and why. So this is anecdotal through teaching versus through research, but it's definitely something I hope to build upon in the future. Many people who are in attendance here today and my fellow panelists are also probably very familiar with examples like Target's use of algorithms to calculate a pregnancy score to kind of predict if you're doing something like buying vitamins, how likely you are to be needing a crib 8 months in the future, and really to categorize people and market to them based on predictions and categorizations. And finally, I wanted to bring up the idea of redlining and digital redlining, and the idea that really decisions about really any financial decision or access to an educational institution, that there's all kinds of ways that algorithms can be implicit and complicit in determining what kind of opportunities exist for individuals in society. So with this background sketched, the way this is played out in a recent project, on my next slide, I have just a quick review of some research which Leslie and I did, where we looked into YouTube Kids, the app, as well as a smart toy by Fisher-Price. And we were really interested here in conducting a privacy sweep to look at a variety of indicators, including the political economy and the ownership model associated with these apps and toys, Internet of Things related of apps and devices, which are collecting children's data through their interactions and their play time with these devices. And echoing much of what Jonathan said, is incredibly challenging for researchers as well as privacy regulators. Our method was adapted from a method that's used by organizations like the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada to try and explore the practices of various commercial data collectors and data custodians. So we were very challenged in tracing the privacy practices and the implications for the collection of children's data in these circumstances. And that challenge definitely echoes much of what Jonathan said around really the high burden that's put on individuals if they're expected to be responsible for the custodianship and the responsibility of the decision making of controlling where their data goes. Another kind of way that this question around inputs and outputs of data, a way that I've explored it in recent work. On the next slide, I have a brief overview. If I could just get you to, thank you so much, Alicia. I am currently working on some research with colleagues Jacqueline Botterill, Marion Bredin, Jennifer Good, and Brittany Melton. And this is just one question from a survey where we've been exploring the resistance practices of Generation Z in relation to advertising. And one way, when I looked back at our survey instrument, one way that we've tried to surface, I think, some kind of attitudes and perspectives about algorithmic literacy is by asking young people who they believe, who has the stronger argument. And this survey question was very directly influenced by the report, Why Am I Seeing This? From New America's Open Technology Institute, and it's by author Spandana Singh. And many of you may be familiar with Netflix changing the thumbnail image for a movie or for a program based on really who they think you will be interested in viewing content of. And this could tie to the race of the actor or the performer who's involved in the programming. And we were interested in asking members of Generation Z if really they find a lot of joy in the content that's presented to them by recommender algorithms. This is very consistent with a lot of the statements by Netflix around the purpose of their recommender algorithmic systems. Do they agree most strongly with Netflix's stance on this? Or do they agree more closely with the New America think tank, who are interested in policymakers protecting user privacy and trying to prevent harm from algorithmic recommendation systems? So once again, this is one question. It's hard to get a full picture of the research, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse of how I'm trying to bake this in methodologically to various projects. Another question that underpins some of my recent work is on the next slide. And in terms of kind of an overarching question about algorithmic literacy, I'm also really interested in how people can probe systems. And I think that it's important for people to understand algorithms. Once again, I am also a skeptic of a lot of transparency and fairness initiatives. And I think that it's integral because of this, that we retain space for people to critically question algorithms, to question their existence and their application, and to contest their use in their everyday life. So how do we do this, and how do we make this happen? Once again, I just like to give you kind of a glimpse into how I'm using some of these ideas in recent work. So during the intro, Leslie mentioned that I've done some research on privacy extension software. And the next slide has a screenshot from a privacy extension software interface. I worked with Alicia Guzek on a project where we looked at 26 privacy extension software titles, and we interviewed 30 individuals associated with producing privacy extension software. And so this is only one screenshot from one software title, but Data Selfie, I'm showing you a little glimpse into this today, because this particular privacy extension software piece, it received funding in 2016. And part of what's happening when users download Data Selfie and they add it to their browser, it allows them really to keep track of their engagement in and with Facebook, and then to see some of the data crunching that may be happening behind the scenes. And in the case of Data Selfie, it's unfortunately no longer available to download. You can't use it anymore because they've stopped paying to access the APIs that made it work and produce visualizations like this. But in brief, Data Selfie used APIs, including the Apply Magic Sauce API from the University of Cambridge. And this particular API helps use like engagements from Facebook to predict psychodemographics. And this is very, very readily applicable to what happens in terms of Cambridge Analytica data and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And so I find it really fascinating that people were building tools to help users take a look under the hood and understand what was happening well before the Cambridge Analytica scandal hit. But that there's a much longer effort, and then people have been aware of these issues for quite some time. So this is definitely one extension that I think has a lot of significance in relation to algorithmic literacy and some possibilities of what we might do to try and increase it and to support it. In terms of other work, if I could get you to forward to my next slide. What can we do? So Leslie's second question for the panelists was, what do you think are best practices for integrating algorithmic literacy into media, digital, data literacy programming? And I don't think that there's really one thing that we can do or one path forward. I think there's probably many interventions that'll be required. But I like to try and leverage windows of opportunity. And I'm building upon John Kingdon's work around policy windows. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to see and find policy windows, and then also to build in and use open source technologies to try and leverage or to try to enhance or build the kind of future that you hope to see in the world. And it's by no means perfect, and it is a little idealistic, but it is a step. It is something that can be done to intervene. And just as a couple examples to wrap it up, a couple of projects that have inspired me recently. They're on the next slide. And I really love Tomo Kiyahara's, I think I've got a typo in the name. I apologize. I'll fix that on the slide deck later, typo in the name. But their tube is a really fantastic project that lets you kind of look into different filter bubbles to see what kind of content you may see if you're a fruitarian versus a climate change denier. And I see a lot of value in these kinds of creative expressions and tools. And I was also really fascinated to see yesterday that Amnesty International, they're calling people to help map where cameras that are involved in facial recognition, really biometric data collection, where they're located around New York City. And I do not know this, but I highly suspect that they're scaffolding upon kind of open source mapping tools to do this work. And these kinds of examples and their connections to kind of open source software development are something I find interesting and interesting, but also a little bit hopeful in a space where there are many persisting and problematic challenges. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, it's fun to think about all these projects, creative initiatives in order to see where algorithms are going or not. Alicia.
So yeah, I really want to thank Leslie for organizing this panel, and it's really exciting to get together and talk to everyone else on this panel whose ideas I can't wait to engage with. I think that in particular, Jonathan, I really liked your quote about the fallacy of privacy self-management. And that's something that I personally really seek to combat, especially the emphasis on privacy in contemporary algorithmic literacy curriculum that's currently recommended to elementary and high school education. And that's what this slide represents. Media Smarts is Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy, and is recommended currently by OISE for implementation in elementary and secondary schools in terms of its algorithmic literacy model. And it focuses very much on privacy awareness, data collection transparency, user self-protection, and data control. And I would actually argue that very much like Monica pointed out, this doesn't teach algorithmic literacy, maybe falls more into the category of data literacy. So I define algorithmic literacy as an awareness of how a platform organizes human activity, not just the content, not just the images or the information, but our activity. And then which values this emphasizes and what kind of norms this produces. And finally, the critical skills to evaluate these norms. I really want to drive home the importance of this definition through a parallel example of traditional critical literacy that I hope is fun. I'm going to use the case of the notorious 2017 Pepsi commercial starring Kendall Jenner. So you might remember this. To quote the New York Times, Pepsi apologized for a controversial advertisement that borrowed imagery from the Black Lives Matter movement after a day of intense criticism. The ad shows attractive young people holding signs with non-specific pleas like "join the conversation." And in a climactic scene, a police officer accepts a can of Pepsi from Kendall Jenner, the youngest Kardashian, setting off raucous approval. This image was compared to a widely shared photo of Aisha Evans, a Black woman who stood firm while being charged by riot police during a protest against police brutality in Baton Rouge in 2016. Critics accused Pepsi of appropriating imagery from serious protests to sell its product, while trivializing the widespread protests against the killings of Black people by the police. So arguably, what the New York Times article is doing here is critical media literacy. According to Ontario's elementary school curriculum, which has a stellar definition of critical literacy, I thought, critical literacy goes beyond conventional critical thinking by focusing on issues related to fairness, equity, and social justice. Critically literate students adopt a critical stance, asking what view of the world the text advances and whether they find this view acceptable. I would argue that as a parallel, The algorithmic literacy that has gained traction and is promoted by organizations like Media Smarts might teach students that if you watch this ad, Pepsi might be using cookies to track your actions. Or that this image is an ad and not footage of a real protest. My point is that algorithmic literacy must do so much more than merely instruct people about how to protect their privacy or recognize misinformation. And that such a curriculum teaches technical skills and, like Jonathan argues, potentially a fallacy, but it doesn't teach critical literacy, and certainly not critical algorithmic literacy. So algorithmic literacy, it can, and I think it must, teach users to recognize the values that algorithms embed in a platform, not just how they curate information, but how they structure user activity and what kind of norms this promotes. In this sense, I align with David Buckingham's 2010 argument that digital literacy must evaluate culture and values. I also build on computer scientists. I know, Jonathan, they dominate these conversations, but I love Philip Ager, the computer scientist who 30 years ago explained algorithmic capture. Ager argued that too much attention was being paid to algorithmic surveillance, privacy infractions, and a fear of Big Brother. This is 30 years ago and it's still so true. That's only half of what algorithms do, he argued. The second, potentially more impactful half is algorithmic capture, which is the deliberate reorganization of human activity. Ager explains that engineers identify domain-specific ontologies of variables based on existing human behavior, and then create algorithms that formalize our online activity. And these algorithms are then applied to standardize and enforce this formalized version of activity through incentives and disincentives. Ager explains the purpose of these algorithms is to organize actions into parsable units. And these units are recorded in taxonomies. And what I think is interesting today is that these taxonomies are the platform's product. And of course, what happens when users conform to these taxonomies on a global scale? Scholars have recorded two-dimensional performativity, naturalized forms of discrimination, the internalization of market norms, governmental compliance, commodification of affect, reputation anxiety, deepening political polarity, and an intimately competitive attention economy. Moreover, as a testament to the power of algorithmic norms, self-promoting behavior that was once criticized as narcissistic is now taught as a proficiency in mandatory Ontario high school career courses. So to summarize, my definition of algorithmic literacy combines algorithmic studies with a standard definition of critical literacy as an awareness of how a platform organizes human activity, the kinds of values and norms this produces, and the critical skills to evaluate the view of the world that algorithms advance in relation to fairness, equity, and social justice. My brief answer to the second question of best practices for integrating algorithmic literacy is maybe more optimistic and idealistic. I don't agree that algorithmic literacy needs to teach a thorough competence and understanding of every algorithm. Just as I don't think we need, for example, to understand what kind of executive conversations went into making that Pepsi ad, but we do need to emphasize the ability to recognize the norms that algorithms promote and how that impacts our lives. And I really loved Karen's suggestion about finding joy. So this is my framework that I call radical algorithmic literacy. And it comes as a set of 7 questions that could be modulated differently for different contexts. I think these could be very elementary questions or very complex, sophisticated questions. What are the platform's incentives? What are its social incentives? What are its technical incentives? What kinds of behavior do these incentives encourage? What do they discourage? What kind of norms do these behaviors produce? And then, just like finding joy, do these norms make me happy? Are these values that I cherish? And this question is to emphasize situated rather than standardized literacy. And finally, the radical question, number 7, what do I want to do about it? Yeah, and so that's my answer to the 2 questions. And here are our image credits. Thanks to Karen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Wonderful. I've got a smile on my face because I think Joy is excellent, but a smile on my face from all the presentations. There is a chit chat here from somebody in the audience that I'll read. Hey, Michael Ridley. I'll read this if you don't mind. If I think of traditional literacy, reading and writing, the emphasis is on both consuming and creating. Most of what I've heard from the panel, algorithmic literacy, is about critical consumption. What about the skills and expertise to create and use algorithms? Isn't this also an essential piece of algorithmic literacy? Excellent question. I agree with you, Mike. Panelists want to comment about Mike's question? Megan.
I can give it a shot. Mike, how did you enjoy my presentation? That is exactly what I tried to address, not just the content that we're digesting, but the ways that algorithms are shaping the ways that we behave and the norms that develops. And do these norms make me happy? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think partially it did. I think, though, we actually need to think about actually constructing algorithms, actually being able to build them in the sense of writing is that flip side of reading. And it's the externalizing ideas and developing power through writing. I think creating algorithms is just another piece of that. And I say this because, and to not to intend to disparage any of the comments, but often folks like us who are working in the social science perspective tend to shy away a little bit from the technical details of how actual algorithms actually work, the techniques and tools. And the reason I think that needs to change is a lot of the technology around creating algorithms are becoming virtually desktop applications. They're kind of like, if I can make an analogy, the word processing of algorithmic creation. And I think if we want to change the impact of these algorithms, the way that we've all just discussed, then we need people who can create them differently as well. So I guess I think what you were saying was in that sort of area, but I just wanted to maybe clarify that a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks for that comment, Mike. Any Karen, do you want to?
Yeah, I just volunteered to respond in the chat. Thanks so much for that comment. I know in relation to my own comments today, I think the reason that I didn't get that far was there's so many steps that might scaffold up towards being able to write algorithms. It still, to me, often it feels like there's things to be done first before I might get to that point in my own work. But as you were speaking, I was kind of imagining what many of you might be familiar with, the game development program and app of Scratch, where you can basically build a game by dragging and dropping different pieces. And I can entirely envision that kind of tool could exist in this space to make it really accessible for anyone, including children, to design an algorithm. To me, what's important is not removing the step where people think about whether data should be processed and whether an algorithm should exist for a particular purpose. But I absolutely take the point that writing algorithms and understanding that citizens should and could have agency in determining what those algorithms do is an important point, an important contribution around algorithmic literacy.
Yeah, and that gets to one of the questions that I had for the panelists was, is around algorithmic transparency. Okay, if you're building them and creating them and knowing how they work, does that contribute towards algorithmic transparency? So might this making and doing be some of the principles in terms of encouraging algorithmic transparency? And this is a way of making these systems accountable for those that it might impact. So that might be one way of thinking about that.
Can I ask something?
Absolutely, please, Tamara. Yes.
I just wanted to first thank everybody on this panel. This is like such an interesting discussion, and I appreciate all of your perspectives. And as I have like a lot of questions, but I'm just going to try to narrow it down to one for now and maybe ask more later. But first, something came up in Karen's presentation, Karen, when you were describing the privacy sweep method. I think this is really interesting, and it led me to think, like, what level of expertise, we're sort of talking in general about users, it seems, but what about regulators? Like, what level of expertise do regulators need to have? And I know I'm bringing this back to the conference theme of regulating platforms, and how do we deal with platform regulation, which no one really knows the answer to, but we're trying to get into. And how much do regulators need to know? Like, all of this stuff has come up around Bill C-10, right now. It's like the most immediate example that comes to mind. And it's all kind of like based on sort of ignorance at the level of the politicians who are crafting this legislation. So I'm wondering if the panelists would like to comment on this idea of literacy expertise for not just general public or children or, you know, whoever it is, but regulators specifically.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. You know, I'm teaching a class called Fake News and Fact Finding at the first year level. And I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years looking through information literacy materials. And as I say in class, you almost need information literacy about information literacy to be able to figure out like which literacy model you want to use in which situation. And so I think to answer both questions, one thing that I think is helpful in terms of framing the conversation is that there are different elements of the literature that focus on literacy as skill development and literacy as knowledge development. And I think the Canadian government, for example, has been criticized for its conceptualization of digital literacy as focusing mainly on like teaching people how to build businesses online, while not teaching them about, you know, literacy as knowledge types of things that I think most of us are talking about. There is overlap. There are ways that you can learn by doing, and that I think is something that's important to keep in mind. But I think if the question is, what should we be focusing on that policymakers should really be learning about in terms of algorithms and algorithmic transparency, I think we should be focusing on the literacy as knowledge space, and making sure that people who are making policy understand the dangers in particular of algorithms, biased algorithms, problematic data sets that algorithms attempt to analyze, and then of course, problematic decisions that result from using algorithms to interpret data sets to then get to decisions. So I would say that making sure that we're focusing on sort of the different types of literacy that emerge in the literacy as knowledge space.
Hi, I would love to chime in and add on a little bit here. I think the question around really how regulators may be able to respond to this, I think that in my ideal world, I would really like to see the possibility for data and privacy related offices. So let's say at the federal level in Canada, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, I would love to see them have some kind of short-term agile hiring process for technologists on particular issues of concern. So basically this idea stems from my concern that it's challenging to hire a technologist who can possibly understand every issue that may be under review. And I imagine that there's the need to hire someone who's an expert in facial recognition technology, Internet of Things, other people who are experts around encryption or signals, and those needs to conduct the inquiry and to conduct the research into the privacy issues. I think there's probably kind of a different combination of individuals that are needed to tackle various problems at various moments in time. In a different kind of sector, consumer reports recently had a call out. They were hiring technologists to start working to conduct privacy assessments of various technologies. And I can imagine that while you would want to have long-term staff and that would be important, that there would also be the need for shorter term agile hiring to happen to really do the work that needs to be done to interrogate and investigate.
Monica, your comment in the chat sort of segues in terms of thinking about, how do you build robust interdisciplinary teams that share the various knowledges that they have from different realms of expertise. And, we emphasize interdisciplinarity a lot, but does it actually really mobilize and actually work in practice? But do you have anything you want to comment about your question or your comment in the chat, Monica?
Yeah, I guess just that, I don't know about all of you, but I'm already overwhelmed trying to understand how to just consume algorithms. I do not have the time to learn how to write them. It's not that I don't think it's important. I just think that, there are people who know how to do that. And so why not encourage collaboration with those people instead of try to take everything on? However, it is really hard. I think a lot of just academic protocols disallow that kind of interdisciplinarity. I've even suggested to my partner who's an engineer that we write something together, and he said, yeah, I don't know if my supervisor would go for that. Just because
go for it. I say go for it.
Yeah, they have to publish in certain journals and spend their time during, and so yeah, I think there's a lot more layers to just are we learning to write them or not? I think there's a lot of things inhibiting us from doing that. And I will just reiterate that, this is a challenge that I think about a lot again, with the population that my research focuses on, with adults with low literacy, is that, we are trying to read and write just regularly first. And then where do we go first? Do we go to the technical side or the consumption side? What is the most useful to them immediately? Because, it could be a very time sensitive issue of how they're interacting with Service Canada or, applying for their CERB. So yeah, it's a really important question. I don't think there's a quick answer.
Is that a satisfactory answer to Laura? It's complicated. I guess it's complicated. Any other panelists want to jump off of that before I get to some of the questions in the chat? Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, maybe so. I really push back against the idea that understanding the problems of algorithms is understanding how algorithms work. And I really build on Tina Boucher's definition or her approach to algorithms, which she conducted ethnographic interviews, and she called it the socio-materiality of algorithms as their most valid product. It's not about the engineers and what they're doing. It's about the results, the consequences, how we're behaving. So many people express, especially my students at school, express the incredible reputation anxiety that they feel. They're afraid to speak in class because of algorithmic ranking that happens on social media and that penalizes them. And the only solution we have right now is more privacy. That's not going to solve the problem. The problem is the algorithmic organization and ranking that's really around building better classifications of customers. It's really about these commercially driven algorithms. And so I think that the best place for policymakers to go to understand algorithms is not the engineers, but is the socio-material products. And by that, I mean interviewing the people that are impacted by it. How anxious are you? How sad are you? What kind of impact has this had on your community, on your activism, on your cohesion, on your ability for solidarity? And I think, as with so much policy, it's most effective when it centers the people most impacted by it. So that's really what I push for, not algorithmic technical understanding. I think that's a fallacy. I love your word, Jonathan. I'm running with it.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm just going to mention a comment that Emmy put in and then get up to Christine's question, because it's 7 minutes after 7, and we have about 8 minutes. But yeah, Emmy, you talked about advisory groups. So government frequently puts together advisory groups where they have various folks with specific expertise. So they could be technologists, humanists, social scientists, members of civil society, et cetera. And often they hire short term. So yeah, that is one way of thinking about building up that disciplinary or interdisciplinary base for sure. Go back to the 1970s, the telecommission reports, and there were poets. There were poets that were on that commission, which was really kind of cool.
Yeah, I think every committee, every commission should have an artist on it because you need it. And
yeah. Great. So, Christine, yes, Monica did mention methodological gaps about digital literacy. So you are asking a question specifically about the last of the roundtable questions, and you say, in terms of the methodological making and doing of digital literacy research, what can be done in digital literacy to become reciprocal with the racial and gendered scholarship from which it draws to enrich itself? How do we position your methods to be non-extractive and circulate knowledge mutually with contributions of racialized and gendered scholarship not directly tied to info literacy? An excellent question. Thank you so much.
So I may not focus so much on the methodological component, but happy to start here and then maybe move into that direction. I think that any approach to solving some of the challenges we've addressed requires what we call distributive justice approaches to policymaking. I mean, it requires acknowledging that certain individuals, certain communities are most likely to be harmed by big data discrimination. And so policy efforts must, whether it's through the design of support mechanisms, such as the development of info mediation services that might help individuals address their reputation. For example, the reputation management industry is emerging, whether it's direction for information fiduciary relationships, which might connect to what we were talking about briefly about these expert panels that the government is putting together to address ethical algorithms, whether it's funding for research or funding for advocacy, or whether it's the direction of our methodologies. Distributive justice approaches, drawing from Rawls and Sen, which acknowledges that equity, not equality, should be the focus, I think is what we need to really be emphasizing. And so as we, I think, struggle to try and figure out what the best policy approaches are, I think always we have to keep in mind again, distributive justice approach to whatever it is that we're doing.
Thanks, Jonathan. Any other panelists want to take up that question? I also think there's a lot of participatory methods that are being developed with communities themselves. So it's not a top-down process, it's a bottom-up. And there's some interesting examples. Monica's working on this annotated bibliography on algorithmic literacy, and it's big and it keeps growing, but there's a whole section on looking at various different sorts of toolkits that have been developed in different ways that involves really inclusive participatory methods. So I think that's one way of going for sure. Emmy, yes, Alicia's questions are a good example of an ethics of care that promotes inclusive research processes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I can maybe add to that.
Please do.
Thanks so much for that, Emmy, and to Christine. What I've been working on in my research is really emphasizing the importance of combining critical race and critical social media scholarship. So I would argue critical race scholarship and communities are not outside. There is not a need for reciprocity when we're inside, right? So I think that this is such an important combination because as I was explaining in my personal definition of algorithmic literacy, I emphasize what the questions of what are the values and norms that platforms circulate, and here critical race and gender scholarship are so essential for evaluating these norms. So I think this work can't be done without these scholars being central to the work. And if I can also add, I'm so interested in the question of how algorithms connect to moral rhetoric. And I'd love to hear what the panel thinks about that, because that's another place where I think it's so important to be working intersectionally. I'm thinking of the rise of corporate social responsibility, for example, recently, that has blossomed alongside social media. And the idea that it's profitable to be moral and moral to be profitable. And we see how algorithmic ranking really promotes solidarity statements right now with Asian communities. And so, yeah, in this case, I think there's so much about like legacies of colonial capitalist exploitation of social difference that algorithms absolutely promote and that make critical race so central to the discussion.
We're all nodding our head in agreement. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody want to comment on that? And it sort of gets, we have 2 minutes left in the panel. Erica's question about potential challenges we might face, lacunas in the current scholarship, or methods that could be effective. So it sort of was wrapping in response to Alicia's and Erica's comment. Anybody want to take that on?
Yeah, I can talk about that just because that's something I care a lot about. So the initial paper that got me really interested in methodological gaps and evaluating algorithmic literacy was Harjittai et al. From last summer. Black box measures, how to study people's algorithm skills in ICS. And there's a really interesting acknowledgement in there. It's like, how do we evaluate algorithmic literacy when the researchers themselves don't even necessarily know what's going on in there? And so I think that relates back to Michael's question of like how much that technical knowledge is important, but like, to what extent do we need to know that in order to make claims or evaluate others' algorithmic literacy? Or, should it be actually the technical experts who are evaluating this and not us? Like, I don't think that it's one or the other, but it brings up a lot of questions. But I think most important is like just kind of reiterating what I brought up before about, what populations, like Erica mentions in her question, we are including in this conversation, because like Alicia says, critical race and gender and class are very heavily implicated in, who's most heavily impacted by algorithms. And yet, Harjittai and other authors are, snowball sampled from like their Twitter feed. And, the people following Esther Harjittai aren't necessarily the people who are having like their Medicaid taken away, like in Virginia Eubanks's book, right? And that's just making a very broad assumption, of course. But I think we just need to be very intentional about how we develop ideas about what algorithmic literacy is around like the populations that we're including in that conversation. Because right now, it's very easy to have very high level discussions about why it's important, where it happens. But, on the everyday, who is really at risk of suffering or, being excluded from certain processes or included in the wrong processes because of this? And what is the most, to evaluate their skills, I think is, not a question or answer I really have a full-fledged idea for, Erica, but I think it is really important of, just being intentional about choosing those recruiting populations. Yeah.
Thanks, Monica. So unless there's any burning responses to that or any burning questions from the audience, I don't see any. I'd like to thank the panelists, Monica, Alicia, Karen, Jonathan. I'd like to thank Tamara and David and Sarah Bannerman for being part of the organizing committee. And thanks for, all sorts of folks for asking the great questions. Erica, Mike, Christine, excellent. And, to be continued 2022, in Hamilton itself, maybe would be great. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. A good time was had by all. Thank you.